Rental rates have shot through the roof.
Honestly, it's very scary.
Do expect rent growth to moderate to perhaps around 5%.
This time around for episode number 5, we're going to talk about the rental rates.
It can go upwards to around like 5,000.
Wow. Where else are we seeing such high rental increases?
One of the most horrific things that has happened over the past 24 months was that in terms of the amount of quantum leap of rental increment, ever since 2020 until today, the amount of percentage, if you calculate on a year-to-year basis, is actually pretty significant. And if you were to look at the current rates right now for a HDB apartment in Punggol, for example, a 4-room HDB, 4-room in the sense that if we talk about 4A model, is about 92 square meters with 3 bedrooms and a hall, kitchen, and of course a home shelter. The rental right now transacted, if you were to refer to HDB website as well as some other sources, is ongoing at about $3,800 to about $4,000 per month. And if you were to look at, for example, the RCR region, just have a look at this newly TOP property at Park Esta. A 2-bedroom right there will easily cost you about $5,000 per month, and a 3-bedder will easily cost you about $6,000 to some of the landlords asking $7,000. Of course, these are great news for landlords, and of course, landlords are battling with the increment in terms of the mortgage interest rates over the past year. However, I think if you are renting an apartment, this is definitely a disadvantage for you in this sense. So we're going to talk about rental today and what is the break-even point if, let's say, you are currently renting, you're waiting on the market, and you're not buying a property. We have done some calculations from our research team, and this is something that we want to talk about on the second part of today's video. First part, I want to head back towards 2020 and try to route back on the milestones on why rental has soared over the past 3 years. Basically, the entire rental situation could have sprouted from one key source, which was COVID. Now, ever since COVID, circuit breaker was announced, and that started on the whole entire pandemic issue around the entire world. What has happened was that over this past 3 years, I think all of us experienced a lot of change. Firstly, we went through circuit breaker, so about 2.5 months we were at home. The next thing was that the new trending started coming out, which is the work from home kind of trending. And I think over the past 6 months, a lot of businesses and companies are having issues with a mindset shift in the sense that they definitely want to take care of the welfare of our employees. But at the same time, they're also having issues about having the mindset shift of their teammates coming back to the office for physical meetings and physical presence. And of course, I think in terms of productivity, that's a whole new topic altogether. But I think over the entire past 3 years, what has happened was that COVID, circuit breaker, pandemic, work from home, and there was a behavior change, not just in families wanting more space within their own apartments. And during 2020 to 2021, there was an uptick in terms of the number of renovation that people have done within their own home, because everybody was trapped at home. They're trapped in their own country. They're not allowed to travel. So I think a lot of savings were reinvested into their own homes to renovate that place to make it a better home to live in, because you're going to spend more time at home during the pandemic season. And that also sprouted out a lot of upgrading movement with people buying bigger homes, having more bedrooms. If you have seen some of our episodes, we talk about the fact that a lot of our clients actually contacted us and we have helped them did successful shifts to sell their current property in the same condominium and upgrade to a bigger one. For example, like a 3-bedder to a 4-bedder or 2-bedder to a 3-bedder within the same development. So this was some of the behavioral change that everybody and you and me has experienced over the past couple of years. And one thing that we noticed was also the uptick in the amount of people moving out of their homes. So there was also a season, I think that was in 2021, that a lot of single professionals were actually moving out of their homes that they were occupying together with their parents and their siblings. And because everybody was working from home, you get to rub shoulders every single day. And I think that also gave rise to a lot of newfound needs, that you want your own space and you want like your own private space. You want a bigger space for you to to work from home, exercise from home, and then you want to rest well as well. And thus, I think there was a season whereby the 1-beders and the 2-beders and studio apartments were actually taken up very rapidly. I believe that was the key onset of the entire rental situation, because we only started to feel that rental rates started to increase drastically in the year 2022. So take a look at an example in our previous webinar that we talk about the rental rates in this particular condo project at Cosmopolitan. So the amount of increment that has went up was like 47% over a period of a couple of months, and a 4-bedder back then was about $7,000, and then at the point of rental it was already about 11 to 12k. Now it's about 14,000 for a 4-bedder right there in River Valley. And if we were to look at across board HDB apartments, condo apartments, and landed properties, they have all soared in terms of rental prices. And contributing to this was not just the movement of single professionals wanting their own space, it was also because of the delay in BTO properties as well as new launch condo properties, because the construction phase of BTO properties as well as brand new condo projects that was sold during the show flat season was technically delayed. And when these properties are being delayed, the families that have already sold off their homes, their resale homes, and then they are renting in the market, they have to prolong their rental. So for example, somebody that have sold their condominium and they have bought into a new launch, they might have just signed a 1-year lease or maybe a 2-year lease, because maybe they bought into a balanced inventory unit, but the TOP date was supposed to be at this particular date, but it was further delayed by another 1.5 years, for example. That means that they have to extend their rental for 1.5 to 2 years, because even after you take possession of your new home keys, you still have to spend time for defects check. You still have to spend time for renovation, and then you need to add a couple of months to complete that process. And because of that, a lot of existing families have extended their rental, and thus that then created a lot more demand in the market. The third one was also coupled with families that went out to rent for a short period of time, for example 6 months, because they want to do their renovation for their existing home, or maybe they went out to rent for 1 year because they want to do A&A for their existing landed home, or maybe they want to go through like a full-on renovation for their landed property that takes a longer period of time. So all this has then created like a newfound demand. And what is potentially going to happen this year to year 2026 is that if you look at our latest webinar, so there's going to be plus minus about 38 projects that will hit their TOP date this year in the year 2023. What might potentially happen is that the investors that has bought into these 38 projects, if they're bought into 1 to 2 beders, they will most likely want to rent them out. Now, if there are buyers that have bought into, let's say, the 2-bed, 3-bed, or 4-beders, they might move in to stay. But when they move in to stay, they will then complete their existing lease, and thus that will then free up a little bit more supply in the existing rental market. And when they move in, all these properties will then become fresh supply in the market. At the same time, this 38 projects that will hit its TOP, basically with its 1 to 2 beders being rented out in the market, that should also satisfy a little bit more demand in the rental market. So with these two confluence balancing out, my forecast is that the rental situation towards 2024 should taper off to a more stable level. And what this means is that if you're a tenant, do not lose hope, because rental rates will start to taper off in the next 12 to 24 months, very likely. But of course, that is also contingent on whether is there any BTO properties that will be completed, not just on the condos TOP portion, but also on the BTO properties part. So let's just have a look at this chart here. So this is the estimated number of BTOs completed by year-to-year basis. As you can see, during the 2020 period, there was actually a drop in the blue bar. And this drop in the blue bar basically signifies the part during the pandemic season. And this was the estimated number of units versus the actual number of BTO that was being completed. Of course, this drop actually signifies that a lot of people would then not get their keys and they have to continue to stay with their parents for a longer period of time, or maybe they are already renting outside. And that gave rise, of course, to some of the rental demand. Of course, we do not have the full numbers, but that is basically the entire feel on the ground. And if we were to now move on to the second segment, of course, this is an age-old question, is that should I rent versus buying? And I think in order to answer that question, there's a lot of debate on this two portion. Of course, there are a lot of intangible kind of comparison and pros and cons. There's also a lot of tangible reasons in terms of renting versus buying. And I think to add to these two components, whether it's intangible reasons or tangible reasons, there's also a third component is to see which country are you in. So for example, if you look at Japan, and when you look at United States, you realize that there is actually a large proportion of the residents within these two countries that they actually rent within their own country because the country is huge. They move around different states for work. And let's take, for example, Japan. The largest pool of tenants are actually Japanese themselves, because they come from other parts of Japan to maybe work in Tokyo, and then thus they have to rent in Tokyo. And because they are young working professionals, they might not have the capability to buy a property, and they are also not sure whether will they stay in central Tokyo for a long time because of their work and traveling reasons. So with that, when we look at Singapore, Singapore is already a very small country. In fact, a lot of people call us a city. And with that, when you compare that to our existing ownership rate, so we have one of the highest home ownership rate in the world. We have over 90% of home ownership rate, in the sense that when you look at the entire available stock based on property types in the entire residential market, then you will get to understand why actually it's important to own if you happen to stay in Singapore for a long duration. If you're a permanent resident, if you're a foreigner, or if you're a Singaporean, you need to understand that because of this demographics vis-a-vis our land size, as well as residential inventory, and the way on how our market moves, is actually more beneficial to own than to rent. So if you were to look at the entire pool of properties that's available, and we have about 1.2 million HDB apartments, we have about 340,000 condo apartments and ECs, which are technically executive condominiums, and then we only have 73,000 landed properties, and 90% of the residents here own properties. And it is also our government policy to support Singaporeans to own properties, because if you look at the amount of first-timer grant which our government has just introduced through Budget 2023, they have further raised the amount of grant support for first-time home buyers in order to encourage people to build families. And they have also even increased the amount of grants for first-time singles as well. So the government's direction is that through CPF grants, with the fact that every working adult in Singapore, if you're a Singaporean or PR, you get CPF contribution from yourself, a part of your salary, about 20%, plus your employer have to top up additional amount into your CPF account in order to help you take care of your ordinary account for housing, special account for retirement, MediSave account for your healthcare needs. So the direction is that this is to aid you towards having that first set of down payment to own your HDB apartment. So the direction is actually to own your property. And with that, if you are in Singapore, and if 90% of the residents here own their homes, then technically it is not advantageous to become a tenant situation. And the third thing is because of the fact that when we look at how property prices have moved over the past years, so firstly, rental and the price of the property are correlated. When property prices move up, because of the fact that the monthly mortgage that the landlord, if they buy the property for investment, also increases, they will have a gradual increment in expectation for the rental that they want to fetch. And of course, the last thing is also, if you were to look at a white paper, we're going to hit 7 million population within the next 7 years. Right now, we are technically close to about 6 million. We have about 1 million more to go. And of course, after 2030, there might be new white papers that will grow us to 8, 9, or 10 million in terms of population. And with that, with our scarce landscape and everybody in Singapore having a home ownership mindset, it means that it might be better to be a landlord than to be a tenant. The key thing to take away is that in terms of demographics in Singapore, it's a little bit different, because Singaporeans grow up with the mindset of home ownership from a very, very young age. And then coupled with the fact that we are in a land scarce country. And the third thing is that the setup of our residential choices here is being largely dominated by HDB apartments. And HDB apartments are largely being stayed on by the homeowner itself. It's not an investment property. People own HDB apartments for their own stay, as their own home shelter to build their family. And Landed properties are also largely own stay as well, and it's a very small quantity. It only represents about 5% of the overall stock of residential properties. And that leaves the condo apartments having that 340,000 quantity in the market, largely circulating for own stay as well as rental. And thus, if you look at that in terms of the rental supply, sometimes a little bit more limited in the sense that it will largely be catered towards that 340,000 pool, but not forgetting that, this 340,000, there's a large portion of it that is being owned by families that are living in them. And thus, the last piece of the picture is to look at the population growth chart as well, and for the fact that Singapore now is having that safe haven status. And that concludes the point that actually in Singapore, just by all these factors itself as a bedrock, it might be better to own a property than to be a tenant. And let us move on to, of course, the intangible plus tangible pros and cons. Of course, intangible has been an age-old kind of debate. People who love to rent, of course, the main pros is that you're not being tied down to just one property. You can, of course, switch around once every 1 to 2 years. You can enjoy different types of properties in different locations. You have that flexibility. And of course, when market situation is down, you got to enjoy lower rental. When market situation is up, the downside is that you have to pay higher rental rates. The good thing is as well is that you don't have to spend renovation costs, because as a tenant, you cannot renovate the place, and thus you will not even invest in renovating the place. For your landlord, you will basically, most tenants that are very experienced, they'll dress up the place themselves with nice furniture and accessories and carpets and paintings and stuff, and making the home very beautiful. I've seen a lot of homes that are being tenanted actually looks better than homes that are being owned. And of course, one more thing is that you don't have to pay monthly maintenance fee, no property tax, you don't have to pay mortgage insurance, you don't have to pay the bank interest. You just need to take care of the monthly rental to your landlord. And as long as you pay the rent on time, you can stay in the home in a very secure fashion. And of course, the downside is that there are changes to your landlord's interest. For example, when they want to sell their property, sometimes the downside is that you get disturbed as a tenant, because the landlord will need their agents and brokers to bring buyers to view the place, maybe during the weekends. And most of the viewings takes place during the weekends, because buyers are usually free on the weekends, as most people work on the weekdays. So weekends is your rest time as a tenant, but then you have to cater time for home viewings, and thus that might disrupt your schedule and your own rest time. And of course, the downside of being a tenant, of course, is that you cannot have the luxury to design and renovate and hack down walls, and thus there might be a certain layout that you want to do. There might be a bookshelf that you want to create for your kids, but you can't do that. You can't renovate the place, and you are also at the mercy of rental increment if your kids and yourself fall in love with the property and you want to renew for another 2 years. And if the landlord wants to increase the rental, then of course negotiation has to take place once every 1 or 2 years, which can be a hassle. And then of course, if you look at the other side of the tangible benefits of pros and cons of rental versus purchase, is that the moment you purchase a property, technically speaking, the monthly mortgage that you pay is not gone to waste, because there's always this principal plus interest portion. Principal is your savings into the asset. And take note that real estate is an asset class that allows you to own the physical asset. You own the title to that property. If you buy a strata title property, you own the title to that strata space, to the apartment. It belongs to you. If you buy a landed property, the land title belongs to you. The building sitting on the land belongs to you as well. And of course, when you own the property, the upside is that you don't have to be at the mercy of a landlord. You have longevity, you have security, and sometimes ownership creates a secure feeling for your family, especially if you have children, and you just don't want to have that feeling that every 2 years you have this numbing feeling that, you know, I might need to move because my landlord might want to take back the place, my landlord might want to move in, my landlord might want to sell the place, or my landlord might even want to raise my rent. And thus, there's a lot of intangible benefits to owning as well. And of course, the next thing is that on top of that ownership feeling, and on top of having that principal plus interest portion, you can also utilize that property to be a sub-investment property, in the sense that if, let's say, you have the ability to own a second property, you can move out to your new property, you can rent out this place and let your tenant contribute towards the P&I portion every month. So your tenant technically will pay for the interest, the balance will go into your principal. If there are excess, if let's say rental exceeds your mortgage, that becomes a passive income to pay off some of the monthly MCST fee. And if you still have passive income, then that technically becomes a positive cash flow property that contributes to these 4 components: the interest to the bank, the principal as your equity savings, the MCST fees to maintain the property, and of course, last but not least, your passive income in terms of excess cash that you can utilize for any other things. Of course, for ownership, you have to pay property tax. You have to, of course, maintain your property. And of course, as the owner, in exchange for ownership, these are definitely the things that every homeowner will need to do. But we'll leave that to you to weigh the tangible and the intangible portion. But most importantly is that if you were to look at this data point that we have, we actually route out an assumption. And we just take an assumption of this particular property. For example, a 3-bedder at 1.8 million now. And we put in this few parameters in the sense that if you were to be a buyer and you put in a 25% down payment, you take a loan of 4% for the next 30 years, and assuming that interest rate stays the same at 4%, how is this going to compare being owning it and renting it? And based on our PRB research team, basically by assuming these parameters, what we realize is that there is a value gap in buying versus renting. So what is this value gap? Technically speaking, what happens over here is this, is that paying off this $1.8 million property is equivalent to 38.5 years of rental. So assuming that the purchase price is $1.8 million, this is being broken down into 25% being down payment, 1.35 being the amount that you loan from the bank. And because you loan from the bank for 30 years, you need to pay the bank a 4% interest of this 30 years, which amounts to $970,000. So all in, this entire amount, which is $1.8 million of a purchase price plus the bank interest, is in totality worth 38.5 years of rent, assuming that the rental rate is at $6,000 a month. So if you're to pay $1.8 million at 4% interest rate for the next 30 years, assuming the interest stays the same, what's going to happen is that your monthly mortgage is going to be $6,445 per month. However, that's being segregated into two portions. One is the principal payment, which is at about $1,945 a month. And the other part, which is $4,005, is actually payment of interest to the bank. So you will start to notice as well that in a high interest rate environment, you actually pay more interest. In a low interest rate environment, if I were to swap this into a 2%, and what is going to happen is that your monthly mortgage instantly drop to $4,989 per month, with $2,007 into your principal and $2,250 into your interest. So that's the core reason why also a lot of people prefer to buy a property in a low interest rate environment. However, in Singapore, we technically pay interest from between 1 to about 4%. And you can take the average about 2.5%, because even if you were to buy a property this year at, let's say, 4% interest rate, it's not going to be forever. Because next year, for example, if Fed were to reduce interest rate, you will then be able to refinance your loan, provided you don't take a lock-in period loan right now, and you can refinance it at 3.5%, followed by 3%, 2.5%, and things like that, so on and so forth. So it's not going to be a perpetual kind of thing. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that if you were to buy a $1.8 million property now, your monthly mortgage is $6,400. If you were to rent this same apartment in this particular condominium, it's going to be about $6,000. So when we take that and then we pump it into basically our data engine, what we realize is these few things. If you were to pay rent for 38.5 years, it's going to complete the full payment of this home, which means that technically speaking, if you continue to rent for 38.5 years, you might as well just buy this home. Because if you own this property, you can still continue to live in it until the 99 years lease runs out. And assuming, let's say, you have lived in this property for 38.5 years, you can still continue to stay for another 10, 15, 20, 30 years until you pass on, right? But if you were to rent for 38.5 years, what this means is that for the next 16.5 years, you are going to continue to pay ongoing rental, assuming that your age, and in this particular scenario, is that if we calculate a horizon of about 50 years, and this is based on a horizon of 50 years. So for example, if you started to rent at 30 years old and you live until age 80, what's going to happen is that if you are a tenant for 30 over years, you still have to continue to rent all the way. And take note that if you want to purchase a property, the bank will take note of your age until age 65 to issue you out a loan for your loan tenure period. And we also back calculated in the sense that for 75 months of rental, or about 6.25 years of rental, you already have accumulated the same amount for the down payment of a $1.8 million home. So that means that if you have rented more than 6 years, you might as well just buy a property, because that 6 years of rental is equivalent to the 25% down payment of this $1.8 million property. So you need to take note of this sweet spot, because if you were to continue to rent 1 year, 2 years, and then you renew for another 2 years, 4 years, take note that the moment you hit 6 years, you have already paid enough rental to pay a down payment of a home, and you might as well take a loan. Because speaking of which, if you can afford a $6,000 rental a month, that means that you can also afford a $6,400 mortgage a month. And that means that in terms of an income level, and most of the time the calculation is that your monthly mortgage or your monthly rental should not exceed about 35% of your total income that you bring home per month. Because if more than that, it's going to be in a very unhealthy zone, that you have no other disposable income for your insurance, for your food, your traveling, your clothing, your kids' education, and your savings and stuff like that. So with that, this 6.25 years is a very nice indication, because the moment you are very near to the 6-year mark, you need to take note that you should actually be buying rather than renting. And if you have rented for 13.5 years, technically speaking, you have already fulfilled the entire 30 years of mortgage interest rate that you're supposed to pay to the bank, which is that $970,000 that we talk about. So if you rent for 13.5 years, you've already paid $900,000 of rental, and you might as well just buy a property. So before you even start the rental journey, of course, there's a lot of argument on that, because for rental, it also will mean that maybe at the point of renting, you do not have that level of down payment to down pay a home. But this applies to families that are trying to time the market. So some families, they maybe are trying to time the market in the sense that they want to sell off their landed or condominium or the HDB, and they want to wait for a downturn or a recession in Singapore, hopefully to hope for the price of properties to come down and then buy it. But they find themselves renting and renewing for years. And then that amount of rental that you paid actually could have been a down payment for your home that you should have bought almost immediately in a back-to-back transaction. Because in Singapore, we talk about it a lot of times, it's very risky to time your market, especially if you're timing your market and you are trying to time your primary residence. And take note that primary residence has an opportunity cost. And you have an opportunity cost that you either own, or you have to rent, or you have to stay with your parents or somebody else. So we only suggest that you should time your market by doing analysis, looking for opportunities for your second, third, fourth property investment. Your primary residence, you should not time the market, because the op cost is just technically too high. So for this episode, we'll talk about the third component, which is the bedrock of the Singapore demographics. We'll talk about the intangible benefits and pros and cons. We'll talk about the tangible benefits and pros and cons of renting and buying. And we hope that this particular episode will help you to make a decision whether you're currently renting, you're timing the market, or you're a homeowner as a landlord. We hope that this episode on Nuggets on the Go will give you value. And I want to see you on the next one, because the next episode is a banter series that will talk about very interesting topics. And we'll see you on the next NOTG. Take care. Right, so this is episode 5.